Well, welcome to 10 Minute Record Reviews, episode 309. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Jimmy Smith from 1957 entitled The Sermon. And what I have here is a 1962 mono repress. Before Jimmy Smith, the electric organ was rarely heard as a lead instrument or even really as an instrument at all in jazz recordings. He changed all that. He revolutionized the way the instrument was perceived and he made it a real thing in jazz. His recordings were highly influential, and there were a lot of them. He made something like 107 recordings as a leader throughout his career. He made 39, I think, for Blue Note and something like 25 or 26 for Verve. Though critical acclaim, which came his way early on, soon proved to be elusive because there didn't end up being too much variety on his recordings. He's kind of the AC/DC of jazz organ. He makes the same viscerally satisfying record over and over and over again. This record, however, is when his ideas and his sound are as fresh as they were ever going to be, and it's possibly the peak of the early part of his career. Jimmy Smith was born in Norristown, Pennsylvania in either 1925 or more probably, because this is what it says in his birth certificate, 1928. He's largely self-taught on piano, and at age 9 he won a radio station contest in Philadelphia for piano players. He drops out of school in the 8th grade. He joins the Navy during the war at age 15, stays in the Navy until 1947 when he's demobilized, and then he goes to music school. His first professional or semi-professional music gig in Philadelphia occurs in the early 1950s when he joins Don Gardner's Sonotones playing piano. Then, in late 1952 or early 1953, he undergoes a life-changing experience because he goes to a club in Philadelphia and he sees a trio led by a guy called William Wild Bill Davis, though he doesn't look that wild, I don't think, in the photo, who was playing a Hammond organ. The Hammond organ, of course, was never intended to be a jazz instrument and had traditionally not been one. It had been invented in the 1930s by a guy called Lawrence Hammond, who had intended it to be a compromise for churches without much cash and who couldn't afford a pipe organ to get that organy sound. People like Count Basie and others, George Gershwin, begin to play around with it, but nobody really makes it stick as a jazz instrument through the 30s and through the 1940s. When Jimmy sees Wild Bill playing the Hammond, he is absolutely gobsmacked, and he goes up and talks to him afterward. And Davis says, "This is a great instrument, but kid, it's going to take you years and years to learn the pedals alone." Smith, not to be deterred, gets a Hammond organ from a loan shark and gets it shipped to a warehouse and basically locks himself away for a year learning how to play this thing. And when he comes out, he's an accomplished Hammond organ player, but he also sounds like nobody else has ever sounded like on the instrument because in addition to the basics of playing the organ, he also had chosen to develop a soloing technique based on not other keyboard players, but based on the bebop soloists, people like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. He's onto something, so he now goes out on his own with a trio with this totally new sound. His timing is absolutely perfect because it occurs just as hard bop is emerging from the chrysalis of bebop. What hard bop does musically, of course, is take gospel, soul, and the blues and usher them into a union, or a reunion more properly, with jazz. And the Hammond organ, with its raw sound but also its churchy feel, provides the perfect emotional range for this. Smith tours all over the East Coast and he creates a kind of craze that follows in his wake. While there were lots of great soloists in this scene, Smith was renowned as the best of them all because he alone had truly mastered the pedal work. All of his hard work pays off in early 1956 when Alfred Lion, the co-founder of Blue Note Records, hears him play in New York, possibly at the Cafe Bohemia, possibly on a bill with Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, but that's not clear. Lion had been tipped off by a piano player he knew, a guy called Freddie Redd, who had good intel because he'd seen Jimmy Smith playing at a club in Philadelphia and he'd been blown away. There was also a DJ in New York called Babs Gonzalez who'd been bigging up Smith and probably also deserves some of the credit for connecting in Alfred Lion. Anyway, Lion digs his sound, he signs him to a deal with Blue Note, and in February 1956, Smith goes in and records his debut for Blue Note, A New Sound, A New Star, which is the first serious appearance by a Hammond organ as a lead instrument in jazz. He quickly becomes an A-lister in the jazz clubs of Manhattan. He's playing clubs like Birdland, and in 1957, he plays the Newport Festival. All this time, he's making records at a frenetic, possibly unequaled pace for Blue Note, and this record is recorded, or at least it begins to be recorded, that summer of 1957 when Smith is one of the hottest properties in jazz. This record is made on two different dates, on August 25th, 1957, and then exactly 6 months later, on February 25th, 1958. The engineer is Rudy Van Gelder, but this record is not made at Rudy's house in Hackensack, New Jersey, nor is it made in his soon-to-be-open studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, it's actually made at the Manhattan Towers Hotel Ballroom. This was a place which Rudy would occasionally use, particularly in 1957 and 1958, as a venue for recording when either his house was too small for the number of players, or, as must have been the case here, because there's only at most 6 people playing at any one time in this record, when it was just more convenient to have a recording in Manhattan as opposed to schlepping everybody out to New Jersey. I'm usually a pretty big fan of Rudy's work, but I have to say I'm not 100% sold on the sound of this record, which sounds pretty reverby and kind of thin, like it's recorded maybe in a hotel ballroom. For me, the Englewood Cliffs and Hackensack locations usually provided much better sound than this. Only 2 musicians participate on all 3 tracks in this record, and of course those are Jimmy Smith on organ and the trumpeter Lee Morgan, who was about 19 years of age. On August 25th, 1957, the first recording session, they're joined by Smith's regular sidemen, Donald Bailey on drums and Eddie McFadden on guitar, as well as the alto player, George Coleman. Perhaps needless to explain, because Smith had mastered the art of playing these walking bass lines with his left hand, he handles all the low end stuff, and there's no bass anywhere in this record. I'm not, again, totally convinced by this approach. I find this gives a kind of a dry sound, but I might be in the minority. Anyway, that quintet on that day records just one track, a Smith composition, but really kind of a jam called JOS, which are his initials. When Lion brings Smith and Morgan back in February to complete the record, they make 2 more tracks, this time adding Art Blakey on drums and Kenny Burrell on guitar. The 2 tracks they make are The Sermon and Flamingo. On The Sermon, they add 2 horn players, Tina Brooks on tenor sax and Lou Donaldson on alto. Side 1 starts with a sermon, and yes, this is a jam, but what a jam. Jimmy sets the tone with a walking bass line in this phenomenal bluesy solo. Then we hear from Kenny Burrell, who's great, but the real highlight of this track for me is Tina Brooks, who plays this extended solo, which has all these compositional complexities, which just basically show the size of his musical brain. It's an incredible thing. He never runs out of ideas for a good 5 minutes, I'd say. Then Morgan's solo, which starts off kind of playfully and then eventually shows this incredible control that he had in the higher range of the instrument. Bringing up the rear is Donaldson, who always is at home playing the blues and plays with increasing flair. This is just an amazing track where every single soloist is just on fire. Side 2 starts with JOS, which is a jam, just like the sermon, not quite as long. And if you're thinking, well, it's just more of the same, it's not, because this, of course, is quite a different lineup from a different date. This is the August lineup. And in particular, George Coleman has a melodic approach to playing alto, which is really quite distinct from what we heard in the first track. And he uses some scales and just some overall feels, which to my ears are kind of Middle Eastern, I guess, for lack of a better term. Anyway, really interesting track. And you can hear why Miles might have wanted this guy in his group, just because he's so inventive. It's also got some kind of weird elements to it. In particular, the fact that Smith uses this kind of beeping tone that he gets out of his organ, apparently to signal to people that their solo is up and somebody else needs to take their turn. Coleman is subjected to this and he complies, but then Morgan is soloing and he doesn't respond when Smith's going beep, beep, beep like this. Anyway, eventually he stops playing. I think maybe Jimmy was just impatient because he actually had a lot to say in his solo, which is very inventive. The final track in the record is Flamingo, which is from the February session, and this is a total change of pace. Unlike the 2 kind of sweaty, bluesy workouts we've had so far, this is a standard. It is very mellow. It's basically a vehicle for some wonderful trumpet playing from Morgan. My complaint about the organ as a substitute for the bass is maybe, in my mind, the clearest here, because the organ doesn't contribute much solo-wise, but as an accompanying instrument, what it sort of does, and maybe this is the organ, and maybe it's Rudy, and maybe it's the venue, I don't know, but it just seems to kind of muddy things up. This record is dominated by its title track, which of course is a sidelong jam. Every single soloist is absolutely red hot all the way through, and in particular, Brooks and Morgan are totally on fire. And the switch up of players on side 2, potentially a weakness for the record, is in fact a strength because of the freshness that Coleman brings in his approach. At points, the venue or the engineering and or the optimism about the flexibility of the Hammond organ as a substitute for the bass, I think kind of interfere with the clarity and presence of the music. But make no mistake, this record contains 2 sides of Hammondy goodness. And if you're just venturing into Smith's enormous catalog for the first time, this is a great place to start. For me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.